Welcome to Stories from the Front. Take a second to like, subscribe, and activate notifications. The Ardennes have a unique way of freezing time in our memories. My name is Leonard Foster, and as a sergeant in the 101st Airborne, that December 1944 taught me that some battles never really end, they just become stories we need to tell. The biting cold of Belgium was our first enemy. That December, while holding my M1 Garand rifle with numb hands, I commanded a platoon of 12 men. Among them was my best friend, Frank Morrison, a boy from Kansas who always carried a harmonica in his uniform pocket. He never played it in combat, of course, but in the rare hours of rest, his melodies reminded us of home. Our position was in a small wood on the outskirts of Bastogne. The uneven terrain and snow-covered trees gave us some camouflage, but also limited our visibility. We were defending a crucial strategic point to stop the German advance, and we knew we were the last line of defense in that sector. On the morning of December 16th, the fog was so dense that we could barely see beyond 20 meters. The silence was disturbing, interrupted only by the occasional snap of branches under the weight of the snow. That was when we first heard the unmistakable sound of German Tiger tanks approaching. The roar of the engines reverberated through the forest, making the very air vibrate. "Prepare positions," I ordered in a low voice, as my men moved silently to their posts. We only had 2 bazooka rocket launchers and a few anti-personnel mines. Against the Tigers, it was like trying to bring down an elephant with stones. The first tank appeared like a ghost through the mist. It was a terrifying sight. 57 tons of German steel advancing inexorably towards us. Behind it, I could make out the silhouettes of enemy infantry. We gave specific orders. No one was to fire until the enemy was very close. Every shot had a count. Morrison stood next to me, his normally jovial face now marked by tension. "We'll be massacred, Len," he whispered, but his voice didn't show fear, just a terrible certainty. I responded with an almost imperceptible nod, keeping my eyes fixed on the enemy advance. The first shot came from Klein, our bazooka expert. The projectile cut through the air with a whistle and hit the lead tank, but bounced off its frontal armor at a bad angle. It was like poking an angry bear. The response was immediate. The Tiger's cannon swiveled towards us and fired. The explosion destroyed part of our cover, throwing shrapnel and tree fragments in all directions. The fighting had begun, and it was brutal. Our only advantage was that we knew the terrain and had prepared defensive positions. We used shallow trenches and natural shelters to protect ourselves, moving constantly to confuse the enemy about our real numbers. The snow began to melt in the heat of combat, turning the ground into mud. The air was heavy with the smoke of gunfire and the acrid smell of gunpowder. The Tigers continued to advance methodically, their machine guns sweeping through our positions. The German infantry followed them, using the tanks as cover. That's when Morrison had a desperate idea. "The trees, Len," he shouted between bursts from his Thompson. "If we cut down the right trees, we can block the tank's path." It was risky, but it was our only chance. I quickly reorganized the platoon. While some of the men kept up suppressive fire, others started using explosives to cut down strategically placed trees. The plan partially worked. 2 Tigers got stuck between the fallen logs, forcing the others to look for alternative routes. This gave us a few precious minutes to regroup and reposition our defenses, but we knew it was only a postponement of the inevitable. The battle continued for hours that seemed like days. We lost some good men that morning, including Klein, who was hit while attempting one last shot with his bazooka. Each casualty was like a physical blow, but we couldn't afford to stop and mourn. The radio remained silent, except for sparse, confused messages. We were practically isolated, defending our position tooth and nail. Ammunition was running low, and the cold was seeping back into our bones as the adrenaline subsided. This was just the first part of one of the longest days of my life. The next few hours would bring even more challenges and sacrifices, testing not only our fighting ability, but also our humanity. The Battle of the Ardennes was just beginning, and we were in the eye of the hurricane. When the afternoon arrived, the scenery had changed dramatically. The snow, once immaculately white, was now stained black with gunpowder and red with blood on both sides. Morrison and I found ourselves entrenched behind the remains of one of the tigers we had managed to neutralize, thanks to a stroke of luck when we hit its side belt. "We need to relocate the man," I whispered to Morrison as I reloaded my M1 Garand with hands shaking from the cold and exhaustion. Of the original 12 men in the platoon, there were now only 8 left. Each loss weighed on my conscience like lead. The sound of German mortars began to echo in the distance. It was a sound we had learned to fear, the deadly whistle that preceded the explosion. "Cover!" I shouted, and my men threw themselves into position as the explosion shook the earth around us. Wilson, our radio operator, crawled to my position. "Sergeant Foster, I made contact with command. The 4th Armored Division is trying to break through the siege to the southeast, but it will take them at least 24 hours to reach us." 24 hours seemed like an eternity. Our ammunition was half gone, the cold was starting to take its toll, and the Germans were pressing on. We needed a new plan. That's when I noticed something through my binoculars. The Germans were reorganizing their forces, moving their Tigers into a new formation. They were probably planning a coordinated attack at dusk, when our visibility would be even more compromised. "Morrison," I called out to my friend, "remember that mission in Corentin? When we used the destroyed buildings to create an ambush?" His eyes lit up with understanding. It was risky, but it could work. I quickly organized the platoon into 3 groups. The first, led by Morrison, would be our decoy, attracting the Germans' attention with controlled fire. The second group, under my command, would position itself on the flanks with our last bazooka. The third group, commanded by Wilson, would provide cover and keep our retreat route safe. The next few hours were an exercise in patience and nerves of steel. The sun was beginning to set, and the temperature dropped even lower. We could see our own breath forming small clouds in the icy air. The occasional silence was broken only by the creaking of tank tracks and the occasional artillery shot in the distance. "Hold position," I ordered over the field radio, while observing the enemy's first movements. As predicted, they advanced towards us, confident in their numerical superiority and armor. Morrison initiated the first phase of the plan, his group firing in a calculated manner, making it look like we were desperately defending our main position. The Germans took the bait, concentrating their fire in that direction. That's when I launched our counterattack. My group came up from the flanks, catching the Tigers at their most vulnerable points. Our last bazooka charge found its target, the side of one of the tanks, causing an explosion that lit up the darkened sky. The ensuing confusion was our moment of opportunity. The German infantry, momentarily disoriented, offered clear targets. Morrison led a daring charge, his Thompson burst creating havoc in the enemy lines. But the Germans were no novices. They quickly reorganized, and soon we were under heavy fire again. A mortar fell near Wilson's position, and for an agonizing moment, we lost contact with his group. "We need to retreat," I shouted, realizing that we had pushed our luck too far. Morrison coordinated the retreat while I provided cover. That's when I heard a sound I'll never forget, the dry click of a rifle running out of ammunition. Morrison realized my predicament and, without hesitation, threw his last Thompson comb in my direction. It was a move that saved my life but almost cost his. A German sniper saw him exposed, and the impact hit him in the shoulder, not fatally, but the blood began to stain his winter jacket. I dragged him behind a fallen tree while the rest of the platoon kept up suppressive fire. Night was coming, and with it, the temperature plummeted even further. We knew that the next few hours would be crucial for our survival. Dusk in the Ardennes brought with it a deep darkness and an even more biting cold. Morrison was losing blood, and I knew we needed to find safe shelter quickly. Wilson and the others finally reached us, all alive, though some wounded. "There's an abandoned outpost about 300 meters to the east," informed Peters, our scout, who knew the area well. "We can use it as a temporary regrouping point." Carrying Morrison through the snow wasn't easy. Each step was an exercise in willpower, with his weight added to that of our equipment. The distant sound of artillery and tanks constantly reminded us that the enemy was still around, looking for us. When we reached the outpost, actually an old farmhouse that had been partially destroyed, We quickly organized our defense. I put Peters and Anderson in surveillance positions while we treated the wounded. The outpost had some tactical advantages. It offered good visibility of the surrounding terrain and had multiple escape routes. Morrison muttered as I examined his wound. That harmonica, I think I lost it during the fight. His voice was weak, but still held that characteristic humorous tone. My wife will kill me for that. As I looked after him, I remembered our first mission together in Normandy. Morrison was the kind of soldier who kept troop morale high even in the worst situations. Now, watching him struggle to keep his eyes open, I felt a mixture of anger and helplessness. Wilson managed to make contact with command again, but the news wasn't good. The 4th Armored Division was facing strong resistance. Support would take longer than expected. Sergeant Foster, Anderson called out in a low but urgent voice from his position. Movement to the northwest. German patrol. I crept up to his position and looked through the binoculars. It was a reconnaissance group, about 8 men. They moved methodically, checking every structure and grove. It was only a matter of time before they found us. We had to make a difficult decision: remain silent and hope we weren't discovered, or try to eliminate them before they could report our position. Morrison's condition complicated any attempt to move quickly. If they find us, Wilson whispered, the whole main force would come after us. I gathered my remaining men. Listen well, I instructed, keeping my voice low. Anderson and Peters, you will flank from the east. Phillips and Roberts west. Wilson, you stay with Morrison. I'll create a distraction to the north. It was a risky plan, but it was our best chance. I distributed the last grenades and ammunition. Every man knew we couldn't afford to fail. The snow had subsided, but visibility was still poor. I positioned myself behind a pile of rubble and waited for the right moment. The German patrol was getting dangerously close to our position. I threw a smoke grenade in the opposite direction to our position, creating confusion. As expected, part of the German patrol headed off to investigate. That's when Anderson and Peters began their flank attack. The fighting that followed was quick and quiet. We mainly used knives and hand-to-hand blows to avoid attracting attention with gunfire. It was the kind of close, brutal fight that no amount of training really prepares you for. We managed to neutralize the patrol, but not without cost. Phillips was stabbed in the arm, and I received a deep cut in the leg during the fight. We quickly hid the bodies under the snow and returned to the outpost. Morrison was conscious when we got back. You seem to have enjoyed yourselves, he commented, noticing our condition. Even though he was wounded, he hadn't lost his sense of humor. The rest of that night was dedicated to strengthening our defenses and caring for the wounded. We used everything we could find at the post: broken furniture, debris, anything that could serve as a barricade or camouflage. If we survive this, said Morrison as I changed his bandage, you'll have to buy me a new harmonica. I'll buy you a dozen, I replied, trying to keep my tone light, even though I knew our situation was critical. We had limited ammunition, several wounded, and we were surrounded by one of the most powerful armies in the world. The distant sound of tank engines still echoed through the forest, reminding us that our ordeal was far from over. The night would be long, and dawn would bring new challenges. But as I watched my men, tired, wounded, but still determined, I felt a deep sense of pride. In the midst of the freezing hell of the Ardennes, we found strength in each other. The penetrating cold of that night in the Ardennes brought with it a sepulchral silence, broken only by the occasional moans of the wounded. Morrison was running a high fever, and our medical supplies were scarce. Watching through a broken window of the outpost, I saw the first snowflakes begin to fall again. Sergeant Foster, Wilson whispered, approaching cautiously. We've intercepted German communications. They're planning a coordinated attack at dawn. 3 Tigers and at least 1 company of infantry. The news weighed like lead in my stomach. We had 7 men in fighting condition, including me, and ammunition for perhaps an hour of intense resistance. Morrison needed urgent medical attention, and our position, although defensible, couldn't withstand a large-scale attack. How's the radio? I asked, already knowing the answer from the look on Wilson's face. Dead, sir. The battery couldn't take the cold. I gathered the men who could still fight for an impromptu council of war. Peters, our scout, drew a crude map on the dusty ground, showing our current position and possible escape routes. There's a 101st Medical Aid Station about 5 kilometers to the south, Peters explained. But the road is exposed, and in this weather, what if we don't move? Anderson interrupted. We can fortify this position. Fight until we're all dead? A cut in? No. I've seen too many men die today. That's when Morrison, even in his feverish state, made a comment that changed everything. Len, humo be samere gris? When we used the parachutes, his voice faded, but the idea was planted. In St. Mere-Église, we had used abandoned white parachutes to camouflage ourselves during a night retreat. Here, we had something just as valuable. White sheets found at the outpost. Phillips, Roberts, look for any white material you can find. I ordered. Anderson, prepare makeshift stretchers for the wounded. Wilson, check our remaining ammunition. Distribute evenly. We worked quickly, turning sheets into camouflage covers. The plan was risky. We would move at night, using the snow as cover. The men in the best condition would carry the wounded. Morrison would be our priority. If we are discovered, I instructed as I adjusted my own camouflage, don't stop moving. Keep dispersed. Our only chance is to reach that medical post. At 0200 hours, we started moving. The snow was falling more heavily now, which was both a blessing and a curse. Visibility was poor, but that went for both sides. The muffled sound of our footsteps in the deep snow seemed deafening to my strained ears. Morrison, semi-conscious, muttered occasionally. Every sound made me freeze, fearing that enemy patrols might be nearby. Peters led our column, using his experience in reconnaissance to choose the safest route. After an hour of slow, cautious movement, we heard tank engines in the distance. I ordered everyone to lie down. Through the blizzard, I saw the dark silhouettes of the Tigers moving in the distance, their searchlights cutting through the darkness like knives. Don't move, I whispered, even though it was unnecessary. Every man knew that the slightest movement could give us away. The tanks passed about 200 meters from our position, heading towards the outpost we had abandoned. We would soon have company at our rear, which made it even more crucial to keep up our pace. The temperature continued to drop, and the biting wind penetrated even through our improvised white coats. I kept close to Morrison, monitoring his increasingly shallow breathing. I wouldn't lose another man that night. 3 hours after we began our retreat, Peter signaled that we had reached a critical point. We needed to cross an open area of approximately 100 meters. On the other side was the relative safety of the dense forest, but that exposed stretch could be our undoing. We'll cross in groups of 3, I ordered. Keep an interval of 5 minutes between each group. If one group is discovered, the others must keep moving. I watched as the first group started across, their white-coated bodies almost invisible against the snow. The second group followed, and then it was my turn, along with Morrison and Wilson. Each step was an exercise in self-control, fighting the urge to run. We were halfway there when we heard the unmistakable sound of a German plane flying over the area. We threw ourselves into the snow, praying that our camouflage would work. The roar of the engine passed over us, and for an eternal moment, I thought we would be discovered. But the plane continued on its course, and we continued our desperate journey through that white hell. The war had taught us that sometimes true courage lies not in fighting, but in knowing when to retreat in order to fight another day. And that night in the Ardennes, every step in the snow was a battle for survival. The medical station of the 101st emerged through the blizzard like a beacon of hope. After hours of grueling marching across the icy terrain, we finally reached our goal. Morrison was unconscious when we arrived, his shallow breathing making me increasingly worried. "We need a doctor," I shouted as soon as we identified ourselves to the sentries. The movement was immediate. Nurses rushed to help Morrison and the other wounded, while I watched, feeling the weight of the whole night finally fall on my shoulders. Captain Harris, the medical officer in charge of the post, came personally to examine Morrison. "He's lost a lot of blood," he said after a quick assessment, "but he's a strong man. We'll do what we can." While the medical team worked, I gathered my remaining men to assess our situation. The medical post was relatively well defended, with around 30 men in fighting condition and a few heavy machine guns. But we all knew that if the Germans discovered our location, we wouldn't be strong enough to withstand a determined attack. Wilson approached with news from command. The 4th Armored is still trying to break through the enemy lines, but the resistance is fierce. Maybe another 12 hours until they get here. 12 hours. It seemed like an eternity. The distant sound of artillery constantly reminded us that the battle continued to roar around us. The Ardennes had become a cauldron of violence and destruction. "Len," I heard a faint voice call out. It was Morrison, fresh from surgery. His face was pale, but his eyes held that familiar gleam. "I think I still owe you a song on a harmonica." I smiled, feeling a lump in my throat. "Save your strength, you stubborn idiot. You'll have plenty of time to play when we get home." Captain Harris called me to a meeting with the other officers present at the post. The situation was critical. In addition to the wounded under our care, we had information that the Germans were systematically attacking medical facilities in violation of all the conventions of war. "We need to draw up an evacuation plan," Harris explained, pointing to a map. "If we're attacked, we can't risk our patients." I spent the next few hours helping to fortify the perimeter and organizing defense teams. Every man capable of holding a gun was assigned to a position. We used ambulances and jeeps as makeshift barricades, creating predefined firing lines. At around 0900 hours, our fears were realized. A scout returned with the news that a German armored column was approaching our position. Apparently, an informant had revealed the location of the medical post. "All patients who can walk must be evacuated immediately," Harris ordered. "The most serious cases will be transported in the remaining ambulances." I watched as they took Morrison to one of the ambulances. He tried to protest, wanted to stay and fight, but he was too weak even to lift his head. "Don't die here, Len," were his last words before being taken away. Taking over one of the perimeter defense points brought me a strange sense of calm. It was as if all the previous battles had just been a prelude to this moment. Wilson and Peters were with me, along with some doctors and nurses who had refused to evacuate. "If we're going to do this," said Wilson, checking his Thompson, "let's do it right." The first Tiger appeared on the main road at 0930 hours. Its monstrous silhouette emerged from the mist like an ancient predator. Behind it, 2 more tanks and at least 1 company of infantry. "Wait for my command," I instructed over the radio. Every man in position knew that our mission was simple: to allow enough time for the wounded to be evacuated safely. What followed was one of the most intense hours of the entire war. We used every trick we had learned over the last few weeks. Our concentrated fire forced the German infantry to scatter, while the heavy machine guns kept the tanks on their toes. Peters managed a lucky break with a rocket launcher, hitting the wake of one of the Tigers, partially blocking the road. This created a bottleneck that we used to our advantage, concentrating fire on the points where the Germans were trying to regroup. But we knew it was only a matter of time. Our ammunition was dwindling fast, and the enemy continued to press. Harris coordinated the resistance with the calm of an experienced surgeon, moving men and resources around as the situation demanded. That's when we heard the sweetest sound possible, the distinctive roar of the 4th Armored Division's Sherman engines. The cavalry was finally arriving. The final fight for the medical post was a surreal mixture of despair and hope. The roar of the 4th Armored Division's Sherman tanks approaching was like music to our exhausted ears. But we still had to survive the next few crucial minutes. Wilson was hit next to me, an arm wound that made him drop his Thompson. I pulled him behind our makeshift cover as the explosions shook the perimeter of the medical post. Peters continued to hold his position, alternating between firing accurately and coordinating with our last men in combat. "Len," shouted Harris from his position, "we got to hold that line for another 5 minutes." The captain was covered in blood, some of it his own, some from patients he had treated during the battle. His determination to protect the wounded under his care was inspiring. The German Tigers, sensing the approach of our rescue forces, intensified their attacks. The air was thick with gunpowder smoke and melting snow, creating a ghostly mist through which the shells drew deadly lines. That's when I saw something I'll never forget. One of the doctors, Dr. Reynolds, abandoned as cover to rescue a wounded soldier who had fallen in an exposed area. Without hesitation, I provided cover, my M1 Garand spitting fire at any enemy movement that might threaten them. The first Sherman loomed like a steel giant through the mist, its cannon already engaging the nearest Tiger. The impact of the battle between the tanks made the very ground shake. The infantry of the 4th Armored advanced methodically, using the Shermans as cover. "Keep up the pressure," I ordered, reorganizing our men to coordinate with the rescue advance. The adrenaline masked the exhaustion of hours of continuous combat, but every movement required a conscious effort. Between the explosions and machine gun bursts, I could make out a familiar voice on the radio. It was Morrison. Apparently, he had persuaded one of the ambulances to return with medical supplies as soon as he heard about the American counterattack. "I couldn't leave you with all the fun, Len." His voice was weak but determined over the radio. "Besides, I still haven't paid you for that song on the harmonica." The Germans began to retreat when they realized they were outnumbered. Their Tigers, although individually superior, could not compete with the number of Shermans that kept arriving. The enemy infantry began an orderly retreat, covering each other. The next few hours were dedicated to reorganizing and attending to the wounded. The medical post, although damaged, was still functional. Harris worked tirelessly, saving lives with the same determination with which he had coordinated our defense. Morrison was brought back, pale but smiling. "You know," he said as he was carried inside, "I think I need to rethink my music career after that." The battle for the medical post would later be recognized as a crucial moment in the defense of Bastogne. Our resistance not only saved dozens of lives of wounded soldiers, but also contributed to disrupting the German advance in that sector. Weeks later, when the snow began to melt and the Germans were finally driven out of the Ardennes, I revisited the site with Morrison, who was recovering well. Among the wreckage of the battle, we found something surprising: his harmonica, miraculously intact under the rubble. "I guess this means you won't have to buy me a new one," he joked, wiping the instrument on his jacket sleeve. "Play something," I asked, sitting down on an abandoned ammunition crate. And there, among the scars of war, Morrison played Amazing Grace. The soft sound of the harmonica echoed through the Ardennes forest, a melody of hope and survival that seemed to heal something deep in our war-torn souls. Today, 79 years later, when people ask me about the Battle of the Ardennes, I don't just talk about military strategies or the number of casualties. I talk about Morrison and his harmonica, about Captain Harris and his unwavering courage, about Wilson, Peters, and all the others who fought not just for victory, but for humanity in the midst of chaos. Morrison's harmonica is now on display in the Museum of the 101st Airborne Division. Sometimes I visit the place, and looking at that little instrument, I remember not only the horror of war, but also the moments of extraordinary courage and friendship that kept us human during those dark days in the Ardennes. The war taught us that true victory lies not only in defeating the enemy, but in preserving our humanity even in the darkest moments. And perhaps that is the most valuable lesson we can pass on to future generations, that even in the midst of the cruelest winter, the music of a harmonica can remind us of what we are fighting to protect.